which, quote, proposes that each child must construct anew, for example, concepts of biological inheritance and natural human kinds. This construction is enabled and constrained by powerful, innate, domain-general learning mechanisms such as causal analysis or teleological and essentialist modes of construal, unquote. Now, likewise, Astuti and Harris, in 2008, have argued that children are fundamentally rationalist in respect of their ideas concerning what happens after death, and that this initial rationalism is progressively overcome as they grow up as a function of their taking on the religious ideas of their elders. Rationalist understandings remain cognitively available to a person, however, and the apparent paradoxical attributes of spirits may even be discussed, that they consume food, for example, but have no stomachs. As Astuti and Harris recognize, however, it does not follow, even from an admission that this is difficult to conceive of, that people will give up an idea that spirits consume the spirit substance of foodstuffs. Now, I have no quarrel with Astuti and Harris's primary findings, but in my view, they show only that the youngest children have not yet had experience that would allow them to find out what spirits are. The various sociality theorists, whose work is brought together by Enfield and Levinson, have rather different theoretical commitments. For example, Tomasello, whose earlier groundbreaking work shows that child language acquisition is a constitutive process that is demonstrably not dependent on an innate, domain-specific cognitive module providing the primitive structure of a universal grammar. You must all remember the language acquisition device, Chomsky's language acquisition device, or even on a theory of mind. Rather, Tomasello demonstrates the rapid development of joint attention, gestural skills, especially pointing, and the ability to learn the intentional acts of others. These abilities, taken together with early developing pattern-finding skills, make it possible for children, quote, to find patterns in the way adults use linguistic symbols across different utterances, and to construct the grammatical, abstract dimensions of human linguistic competence, unquote. Likewise, in the Enfield and Levinson volume, another linguist, Susan Golden Meadow, argues convincingly, quote, that the phenomenon of language creation in deaf children tells us that an individual child can reinvent the linguistic wheel, at least in its rudimentary aspects, as long as the child can interact with humans who behave humanely, unquote. Now, there's a certain irony here in that Fodor's initial idea of modularity had everything to do with the idea that humans could not possibly acquire knowledge so complex and highly differentiated as language in the absence of a dedicated, innate language acquisition device. The so-called LAD was among the first modules central to the development of modularity theory throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Now that it is apparently unnecessary, we find it replaced by Tom. Now, sociality theory also takes in developments in the idea of distributed cognition, which is influential, especially in the area of education, and which is associated with Lev and Wenger's work on situated learning and Michael Cole's cultural historical perspective. The idea is more or less congruent with the neuroconstructivist model described earlier. Here, cognitions, quote, are not content-free tools that are brought to bear on this or that problem. Rather, they emerge in a situation tackled by teams of people and the tools available to them, unquote. Salomon is referring to the work of Cole when he argues for the view that, quote, the proper unit of psychological analysis should be the joint, often but not necessarily, socially mediated activity in a cultural context. Hutchins' view would appear to be close to this when he insists that distributed cognition is an approach to the study of all cognition. Quote, distributed cognition sees real-world cognition as a process that involves the interaction of the consequences of past experience for individual, group, and material world with the affordances of the present. In this sense, culture is built into the distributed cognition perspective as at least a context for cognition. This is all very well, but for all the expressed concern for real-world processes, the underlying dualist assumptions remain unaddressed by either Cole or Hutchins, and the model remains therefore computational and ahistorical. Oddly so, given Cole's long insistence on the necessity for incorporating an historical perspective into cognition. The problem lies, I think, in the very way that his cultural, historical, activity-based approach to cognition leads one to think about the distribution of cognition among people, cultural artifacts, and time, unquote. That just seems incoherent to me. I have no idea what that means. By contrast, the unified model of human being that I have argued for makes it obvious that, by virtue of evolution, we humans, like other living things, inhere in the world, from which it follows that inevitably we make use of its manifold aspects in making sense of it intersubjectively over time. But there is no mystery here, I think. I have some sympathy with the idea of researching sociality, but only if it is understood that neurobiological, psychological, and socio-cultural data give us access not to different levels of integration, and thus of explanation, but to aspects of one and the same phenomenon. I argue that we cannot build genuinely explanatory psychological or biological models without reference, at least in principle, to the fact that our biology and psychology are embedded in a long, long history of social relations, whose analysis is going to be germane to any biological and psychological model that purports to be explanatory. Further, our ethnographic analyses of social relations are essential for understanding the historical specificity of intersubjectivity in any given case, and thus for showing how learning processes are themselves structured according to certain ideas about what humans are and can be. Okay, you'll be glad to hear I am drawing to a close. The final section is called Embodiment and Neurophenomenology. Now, we may all be much encouraged by the publication of Evan Thompson's brilliant Mind in Life, in which he argues for a, quote, neurophenomenology, whose aim is to incorporate phenomenological investigations of experience into neuroscientific research on consciousness. Neurophenomenology focuses especially on the temporal dynamics of conscious experience and brain activity. Now, from my point of view, the great thing about a neurophenomenological model of mind is that it is open to coming to grips with human historicity, and precisely for this reason wants anthropological and sociological input. Quote, the idea that phenomenology could stand in an explanatory relation to biology will sound odd to many. What could phenomenology possibly explain in this domain? The answer is nothing less than how certain biological processes are also realizations of selfhood and subjectivity, unquote. Now, of course, most writers, even Evan Thompson, continue to think that the problem is to build culture into their models. But this reintroduces the culture biology distinction that has for so long interfered with our ability to produce a unified model of human being. As I've suggested, however, we do better to analyze ontogeny as an historical process, showing, for example, how language acquisition engages social relations that are themselves historically structured. Now here, Tomasello's wonderfully convincing account of the fundamentals of language acquisition becomes useful again, because it's easy enough to show how the process is intrinsically historical. I have to insist here that intersubjectivity should not be confused with social interaction, nor should the process of making sense intersubjectively of the world be confused with social construction. Where learning is understood as a micro-historical process, the peopled world, for all it operates according to its own dynamics, cannot ever be understood independently of the history of the knowing subject. In other words, the validity of a given scientific study is itself an historically constituted judgment, which is not to say that scientific studies may not be arguably more or less valid. The point is that if our categories are to work analytically, they have to be rendered such by means of ethnographic analysis. They are not to be taken for granted, for they too warrant investigation. Society, individual, biology, culture, self, mind, and so on are cases in point. My argument here is firstly that because temporality inheres in consciousness, learning instantiates the micro-historical processes that over time give rise to the phenomena of consciousness as always open to further differentiation. Secondly, that because transformation and continuity are aspects of the micro-historical process of human autopoiesis, self-creation, self-regulation, ethnographic analyses of ontogeny can provide a way in to theorizing the mutual connections between human evolution, history, a regional history, for example, contemporary lives, consciousness, and the neurobiology of consciousness. Moreover, it is important for us as human scientists to understand that the peopled world provides for all our historically constituted descriptions of it, such that these always and inevitably partial descriptions are rendered objective in different ways. Ethnographic studies of how children make sense of the conditions in the world created for them by adults can contribute to the dynamic systems perspective on human development over time as an autopoietic and historical process, one that grounds the entire spectrum of individual difference within and across regions of the world, in the way that our biology provides for sociality, specifically for empathy and intersubjectivity, as the bedrock condition of human being. Further, the details of ethnographic studies of ontogeny as an historical process feed directly into the argument that the development of the neural processes that characterize human conceptual development is an emergent aspect of the functioning of an embodied nervous system for which intersubjectivity is a necessary condition. Thank you for your patience. I'm impressed.
Thank you, Christina. Nós temos meia hora para fazer alguma discussão. Se alguém tiver alguma pergunta, Christina já disse que estaria bastante disposta a discutir o trabalho dela. Então eu abro para o debate.
Well, thank you very much for your paper. It was very interesting and wasn't difficult to follow, as it was a sacrifice, of course. I would like to know what you think about the theories of social evolution. Although they consider two levels of evolution, like individual level and group level evolution, they are unified as well in one, as different aspects of the same phenomena. In the idea of environment. So if you also go, if you depart from systems theory and the idea of autopoiesis, but that autopoiesis is only possible in the difference to environment, and if group level constitutes a human historical environment, would that be a possibility of unified model of history and individual ontology that's not individual, that goes away from micro process to macro phenomena? I don't know if it's clear. I'm just...
You're taking a sort of straightforwardly Darwinist approach to the way that evolution works, are you? It's a sort of Gould position. You're making a distinction between the evolution of the group and the evolution of the individual, or you're saying that they are aspects of one another?
They are together in the idea of environment and individual.
Well, the whole point, of course, that one of the things that we know about humans is that humans are social animals in the sense that they do live together. And the ontogeny of children require a hell of a lot of looking after, more than other non-human primates, for example. So, you know, that problem arises because of the use of the term individual. And there's always been that problem with Darwinian theory, that there is a notion that, you know, there's a sort of an implicit idea in there that somehow the individual is prior and that the other aspects, you know, it has to be made social. The individual has to be rendered social, which is why you then have that problem. But from my point of view, you don't, because you cannot conceive of human beings outside social relations.
Well, Christina, it's not exactly a question, it's more a speculation. I was wondering to what extent the unified model you proposed to us is also, in a sense, a Fijian model.
Which model? A Fijian model? A
Fijian model of the human life, of the human being. Or, in other words, did you also learn your model from your ethnographic experience in Fiji?
Well, that's a good question. Where I would say that they overlap is that Fijians certainly do, the Fijian idea of the person is as a locus of relationship. And that's quite close to an idea of intersubjectivity. But no, I wouldn't say otherwise it does, because I think that they don't conceive of history in precisely that way. Mind you, it's an ethnographic question. I actually have not done any work on how Fijians conceive of history, so that remains to be found out. I might find out that, yes, you know, it could be the case. It could be the case, and which I would not mind. I would be perfectly happy to say, thanks very much, guys.